I had hoped that the safe completion of my mission would leave me free to return to Mesodaria to resume my regular and less onerous duties. But later that day I was summoned to the Shah's presence and required to stay at court. "I have a further little task for you, Daroga," said my young master, and my heart sank, for I had a sudden unpleasant premonition of what this task was going to entail. "I am honored by the opportunity to be of further service, Imperial Majesty." I parried dutifully, but inside my head a little voice had begun to scream, "Damn! Damn! Damn!" "I intend to make you entirely responsible for the safekeeping of my masked friend," continued the Shah, twisting his thin wisps of mustache to exaggerate their curl. "You will answer for any harm that befalls him during such time as he continues to please me. It is not, you understand, a task that I can entrust to a simple bodyguard. The commission he is to undertake in Mazadarian is a state secret. I require a man of proven skills and loyalty to keep him under surveillance." I repressed a shiver. I wanted to say I would have considerably more success following a moonbeam than trying to keep track of Eric's dubious activities. But the Shah's steely glance told me exactly what my fate would be if I dared to demur. "You are the obvious choice for this assignment, Daroga. Already you know him better than anyone else. It would suit my purpose if you persuaded him to trust you. Befriend him, win his confidence, and keep me informed of any interesting developments. The man intrigues me and fascinates me, but I am well aware that he will bear very careful watching." I bowed my head wretchedly. "It will be as you command, O Shadow of God," I murmured. "I have no need of a bodyguard," said Eric ominously. "I am perfectly able to take care of myself. And as for you, your presence is far more urgently required elsewhere. No one in common charity could possibly expect you to remain here indefinitely. I shall speak to the Shah and have you removed from this farcical position at once." I begged him urgently to do no such thing. "You have no understanding yet of how easy it is to fall from favor in this country, Eric. If you refuse to accept my services, it will seem as a failure on my part, and I shall be punished accordingly, perhaps by many months in prison." "Why do you tolerate such gross injustices?" he demanded quietly. "Why do you not simply write back to your son and tell the Shah to hang himself?" "All that I possess depends upon the Shah's continued favor. My pension and my estate could be stripped from me tomorrow. My son thrown out to die in poverty upon the streets. I beg you to reconsider your request and permit me to serve you in this capacity." "Have you been commissioned to spy on me?" he sighed. I made a reluctant gesture of assent and let my eyes drop to the floor. "Well, that's honest at least," he acknowledged philosophically. "I shall have to make sure your reports are suitably interesting, shan't I? I don't want the Shah getting bored and replacing you with someone more efficient." I glanced up at him, and once again, in spite of myself, I began to laugh. He was a murderer, a thief, and an unbeliever, but against my better judgment, I was beginning to find him likable. Next day I accompanied him to the boundary which separated the harem from the rest of the palace. "This is as far as I am permitted to go," I said. I indicated the two eunuchs who waited to conduct him to the inner sanctum of the Khanum and reminded him that their Turkish yataghans would be trained upon him for the duration of his presence in the shadowed world. I did not think it necessary to say more. His entry to this exclusive domain was in the nature of a special dispensation, such as might occasionally be granted to a doctor. It was a privilege he would abuse on pain of the most terrible death. No one with any pretensions to success at court can afford to overlook the significance of harem intrigue, and I had long ago taken the precaution of opening a private channel of communication within these hollowed walls. It was easy enough to do. Inuits are notoriously fond of money and the things it can buy. The physical effects of castration require them to abstain from alcohol. But they love opium, good perfumes, and rich confectionery. And for the right price, they are willing to talk to anyone who will pay for their information. The Sirigilo was the Khnum's domain, an exclusive, evocative world whose insidious influence spread out through the court like a sweet cloud of poisonous perfume. By tradition, it was a place of bitter rivalries, cunning conspiracies, and sudden violent death. To be the mother of the reigning Shah was to reach the very pinnacle of power, and the President Khnum was a force to be reckoned with, a handsome, vigorous, clever woman who knew how to manipulate her son to the utmost advantage. She ran the harem with a ruthless efficiency, reducing the Shah's three principal wives to timid subservience, and ruling the concubines with a rod of iron. She spent her days eating sugar plums and occasionally smoking a pipe, and out of her frustrated boredom there had hatched some formidable tragedies. I do not think there was a man at court who did not fear her more than he feared the Shah himself. I was willing to pay handsomely for news of Eric's reception in this veiled world of labyrinthine corridors, marbled baths, and hushed whispers. The world of Kismet, where he had yet to find his appointed fate. He was taken to a small courtyard, and there, surrounded by half a dozen Inuits, he waited for the Khnum to appear on the balcony above with her ladies. I was told that she kept him waiting there for over an hour, and that the Inuits were growing deeply uneasy and as he began to pace up and down like a caged tiger, displaying the angry impatience that was already so familiar to me. They were obliged at last to draw their yataghans upon him to confine him to the appointed area, but as they closed in upon him, they were suddenly driven back by a shower of multicolored sparks which issued from his fingertips and ignited a perfect circle of flames around him. When the flames died away, there was a slow, mocking applause from the balcony above, and Eric was left staring up at the veiled and majestic woman who had appeared in the gallery. "I trust," said the Khnum softly, "that you have not come all the way from Russia to simply show me fireworks." "By no means, madame," Eric replied smoothly. "That indeed was a mere trifle, designed to amuse tiresome children." He indicated the Inuits with a contemptuous gesture, and the Khnum laughed outright. "If that is a mere trifle, then I am eager to see your true skills. And also to see you, my friend. The mask is likewise a device to frighten infants. Remove it." He stood very still, his hands clenched by his side, every muscle in his body tensed. "Madam, I crave your indulgence in this." "I would rather not." "Indeed?" The Khnum glanced briefly behind her to silence her whispering women with a single venomous look. "Then perhaps I should remind you that only ladies hide their faces in this country. Remove the mask, or the children will be instructed to perform that service for you, and also to take the precaution of removing your head with it." Still, he made no move to obey her, and the Khnum stirred restlessly, made uneasy by such unpreceded defiance. "If you have no great attachment to your head," she continued slowly, "perhaps you would prefer to share the fate of a Chinese Inuit and carry your genitalia around with you in a small jar of brine." He made a graceful shrug of mocking indifference. "Are you so sure a small jar would contain me, madame?" The Khnum laughed delightedly. "I am sure of nothing where you are concerned, my friend. But I warn you now, in deadly earnest, that this is the last time I shall choose to overlook your disobedience on the matter. Take off the mask." When the mask landed abruptly at her feet, panic broke out behind her as the young women hid their faces in their veils and collided in their terrified urge to distance themselves from the dreadful sight that had been revealed. Be silent, snapped the Kalum viciously. The next woman who screams will be beaten to death for her stupidity, I swear it. Then leave me. Go, all of you. She clapped her hands imperiously, and the women dispersed in a flurry of voluminous pearl-trimmed trousers and thin crepe chemisettes, their many bracelets and necklaces clacking wildly together in their hasty departure. The Khnum placed her elegant hands on the white latticed stonework of the balustrade and smiled down at Eric with immense satisfaction. She drew a huge diamond ring from her finger, and when she tossed it to him, he caught it deftly, almost without appearing to move. If your imagination matches your face, she said quietly, it will make you the most powerful man in Persia. As he placed the diamond upon his little finger, the eunuchs say that he seemed to smile for a moment. Is that a prophecy or a promise? He inquired. Again the Khnum laughed. That, my friend, she said silkily, is entirely for you to decide. It did not take him long to reach the decision. By the time the court left to winter in Mesodarian, he was being called upon to give his opinion at council meetings and remaining present during the Grand Vizier's private audiences with the Shah. It was impossible to determine the Shah's true motives, but he seemed to take a certain delight in baiting his brother-in-law in this fashion. Eric has a certain interesting proposals to make concerning the Darul Funum, my brother, he said one day, leaning back on his divan to observe the effect of his words. I think you should take the trouble to consult him. The Grand Vizier stiffened angrily. With the greatest respect, Imperial Majesty, I should prefer to rely upon the opinions of qualified men of science in all matters that appertain to the college. I must, with deepest humility, suggest that this is not an appropriate field for the talents of a court magician. If I say he is to be consulted, said the Shah with deceptive mildness, then you will consult him. I can assure you that you will find few qualified men of science who can even begin to rival his knowledge in any field. The slave who was serving sherbet was forced to withdraw at that point, and was therefore unable to give me the Grand Vizier's reply. But he told me that he saw Mirza Taqi Khan cast a look of pure venom in Eric's direction before the great double doors closed the scene from his view. I was uneasy, and I hoped that the building of the new palace in Mesodarian would distract Eric's attention from the very dangerous power game that he seemed determined to play. On our return to the northern provinces, I accompanied him to the chosen site, a lovely wooden eminence, half a mile outside Ashraf, and there watched him sketch until darkness fell. Are you ready to go yet, Eric? I sighed at length, as hunger began to gnaw at me inexorably. We've been here for more than 8 hours, you know. Have we? He said vaguely. I suppose you want to eat again. It really isn't necessary to eat more than once a day, you know. Perhaps when you get back to Ashraf, you would have some lanterns sent out here to me. I honestly believe that from that point, utterly absorbed as he was by this project, he would have gladly forsaken court politics entirely. But he had set a ball rolling down a long slope, and it had begun to gather momentum without his aid. Once the preliminary designs for the palace were completed, he began to suffer the irritations that inevitably result when a man makes himself indispensable on too many fronts. Neither the Shah nor the Khanum was prepared to remit their constant demands for amusement and advice. He had implied omnipotence, and consequently they did not expect him to be subject to the limitations of time and energy, which confine ordinary mortals. He was a great magician, and surely a great magician ought to be capable of being in several places at the same time. He was seldom spared attendance at court for more than a day or two, and each time he was parted from the stone and mortar of this slowly rising edifice by a fresh premonitory summons. I was afraid his shimmering temper would finally betray him. The Khanum was the worst perpetrator of his irritable frustration. "I am bored," she complained, stretching languorously on the stained satin cushions in her private chamber, where I am told she had taken to receiving him separated only by a thin gauze curtain. "I am bored, bored, bored. What name do you give to this tedious emotion in your country, Eric?" "L'ennui, madame." "L'ennui," echoed the Khanum softly. "What a charmingly seductive term of phrase you Frenchmen have. Do you ever feel l'ennui, Eric?" "Hardly, madame. Time and idleness are both necessarily prerequisites to boredom, and God knows I have little enough of either commodity these days." "Don't scowl at me like that, you wretch," said the Khanum peevishly. "You are sufficiently ugly already without twisting your horrible face in that fashion. In fact, you are so incredibly and unbelievably repulsive that it's almost attractive in a strange way." He was silent. I am told she often tormented him in this fashion, seeking to exact some unknown response, but he only stared back at her with stony-eyed contempt. "So, you do not feel boredom, then? What, I wonder, are you capable of feeling, Eric?" "Anger," he said softly. "Murderous anger. You will find me more than capable of that, madame." "I think I should like to see you angry," mused the Khanum thoughtfully. "Yes, I think perhaps it would be very interesting. Anger, too, can be strangely attractive, you know, in the right person." The Khanum sat up against her cushions suddenly, watching him through the thin gauze curtain with interest. "Tell me, Eric, have you ever had a woman?" There was a tense, throbbing silence between them. "Come, I demand to be answered," she prompted abruptly. "Are you a virgin?" "Madam," he sighed, "I am very busy." "Too busy for a woman. No true man is that, my friend. Would you like a woman, Eric? I could arrange it, you know. I could imagine it. I can arrange it very easily. And is not that what you surely desire above all things?" Those who were watching say that his hands closed convulsively on the folds of his cloak and began to twist with a slow, savage rhythm. "What I desire above all things," he said coldly, "is to be left in peace to complete my commission without disturbance." The Khanum frowned behind the open-worked aperture of her veil. "You think of nothing else these days but the palace. I am jealous of your ridiculous devotion to a pile of stone and mortar. My son demands altogether too much of your time, and I intend to tell him so. You were brought to Persia for my amusement. Mine. And you will amuse me, Eric, one way or another. I forbid you to return to the site until you have devised some new form of entertainment, an amusing death, perhaps. Go now and think upon it." I met him as he left the harem, and I could see as soon as I looked at him that he was in an evil temper. "She wants amusing deaths?" he shouted. "By God, she shall have them!" He worked like a madman over the following weeks, and within a month it was finished, a strange hexagonal-sided chamber entirely lined with thick mirrors, which puzzled me more intensely when I was invited to view it. "What is it?" I demanded curiously as I stared at my own image reflected an infinite number of times. "It's a torture chamber," he told me shortly. "A mirrored room. Mirrors can kill, Duroga. You may safely take my word for that." His voice raised gooseflesh on my arms and made me suddenly very relieved to leave the chamber. I did not go back again to look at the tortures, but I know of many who subsequently did. People who spoke graphically of horrific illusions taking place within a room heated to the temperature of a furnace, illusions so real they reduced the victims to suicide within a few hours. The Khnum was delighted by the ingenuity of her new toy, and 3 eunuchs were duty required to present themselves in Eric's apartment, bearing variously a great purse laden with gold, a silver-plated hookah, and a plentiful supply of hashish. He tossed the purse carelessly onto an ivory inlaid table without even bothering to glance at the contents. But I saw him examine the hookah with interest as soon as he was reclining on his 4 cushions, with the hookah smoking efficiently between his lips. Presently he tore off the mask and flung it across the room, laughing uncontrollably at nothing in particular, and I recognized in this irrational behavior the first signs of the drug's intoxicating influence. I had never tried hashish, but I knew of its terrible effects. Soon all his senses would be distorted beyond recognition. Time would telescope inward upon him, and the faintest sound would be heard as a deafening roar. Ecstatic euphoria would be succeeded by intense physical desire and a savage need for violence. Some of the worst crimes imaginable have been committed here in Persia under the influence of this particular drug, and I finally understood why the Kingdom had chosen to reward Eric with hashish rather than opium. She was impatient to explore the darker regions of his incomparable imagination. Who knew how many more amusing deaths still waited to be conjured from the dungeon of his tortured mind? I lost count of the number of so-called Babi Dissents who died in the mirrored hell of Eric's chamber of illusion. I lost count of the armed men who died facing him in single combat while the Khanum looked on with satisfaction. Each one a victim of the same cunning piece of catgut which I had first seen wielded with such devastating efficiency that night in Russia. The Punjab lasso was a weapon guaranteed to strike fear into the heart of the toughest warrior, a thin, merciless serpent that came to life only in the hands of its master. It amused the Khanum to boast that there was no man alive capable of surviving a contest in the arena with her self-appointed angel of doom. Before he came to Persia and fell under the malevolent influence, I do not believe that Eric had ever killed purely for pleasure, but with her drugs and her insatiable demand for novelty she awakened his sleeping hatred of men, releasing a demon of savage ingenuity which he could no longer control. Increasingly during this period, he began to escape to my estate, fleeing from the horrors of his own imagination to take refuge in the innocent laughter of a child. "It's so peaceful here," he told me once, in a rare moment of confidence. "It's the only place in Persia where I don't dream that I am drowning in a sea of blood." That night I introduced him to an opium pipe, in the hope that its calming somnolence persuade him to abandon the Khanum's hashish, and the following morning, still wrapped in the drug's hazy cocoon of well-being, he said he would like to visit the local bazaar. He was perfectly lucid, but the pupils of his eyes had contracted to telltale pinpoints, and I knew that he would never have suggested venturing into a crowded place in daylight if he were in full possession of his faculties. "Are you looking for something in particular?" I demanded uncertainly, as we entered the noisy lanes with low vaulted roofs. "Birthday presents," he said absently. "Lots and lots of beautiful birthday presents. Who are those poor, twisted wretches with sticks?" "Beggars, seeking alms," I said with a sigh of resignation. "Let me deal with this, please." I turned aside to do my religious duty, dropping a single coin of small demolition into each begging bowl as expected, and receiving the customary blessings in return. When I glanced around, I saw that Eric was emptying gold coins into the bowls behind my back. "What are you doing?" I demanded with alarm. "Giving alms," he said, mildly surprised by my annoyance. "What's wrong with that?" "You idiot!" I snapped, as I saw the word being hastily passed through the crowd. "Surely you know better than to give such reckless sums to beggars at bazaars. You'll bring every wretch in the vicinity around our heels. We won't be able to move through the streets in a minute." Come on. Catching hold of his cloaks, I hurried him through the crowds until we were safely lost in the press of camels and donkeys that constituted a caravan passing through from the coast. The bazaar was typical of any that are to be found in Persia. Most of the shoppers were men, but the vendors were chiefly women, swathed in black chadars, who sat beside their wares almost under the feet of the carriages and ignored the constant rude and colorful injunctions to get out of the way of the passing traffic. Eric paused by a stall of brightly painted toys and selected a number of purchases, which left me in no doubt of the intended recipient of his birthday presents. Numbed on a sweet cloud of opium, he was shopping with needless extravagance merely to please a blind child. And when the woman at his feet named a truly outrageous price, I was amazed to see him reach into his purse without demeanor. "It is customary to barter before purchasing in a bazaar," I reminded him sternly. "This wretch is asking at least 4 times what she seriously hopes to receive." He glanced at the infant on the woman's lap, and then at the small pinched face peering out from behind her shoulder. "She is poor, and has children to feed. I am able to pay the price she asks without hardship. Why should I stand here and haggle with her like a miser?" "She expects it, Eric, I tell you. It is custom." "Fuck your customs," he said succinctly. I watched dumbfounded as he dropped double the asking price into the woman's trembling hand and waved my servant forward to collect his purchases. "Now," he said, turning to me cheerfully, "tell me where I can buy an opium pipe, and at least a crate of that heavenly poppy cake one burns inside it." Rizzo was waiting for us when we returned, in the wheeled chair to which he had become confined during the course of that winter. He was almost entirely blind now, but there was nothing wrong with his hearing, and I saw his face light up at the first sound of his idol's voice. "Did you get me a surprise?" he demanded eagerly. "Yes, lots of surprises," said Eric softly, wheeling the chair out onto the sunny veranda beyond the garden window. "Come with me and see." Come with me and see. No one else said that to Riza now. Only Eric, and somehow on his lips those words never sounded sad or absurd. I had determined to be reconciled to their odd friendship, for whenever I saw them together, the sheer magnitude of their respective tragedies made me turn my back on my own jealous uneasiness. I tried to forget that my son had chosen to worship a murderer of questionable sanity. But one day I received a fright that made my face reality at last. I walked out into the single garden unexpectedly to find my son stroking a handsome Siamese cat, collared with huge diamonds. There was no doubt over the identity of the animal. It was unquestionably the glory of the empire who sat there with a king's ransom around her slender neck. The glory of the empire, the Shah's most favored and treasured possession. "Are you quite mad?" I said furiously to Eric. "Are you determined to have us all killed for this crazy theft?" "Stop shouting. You're frightening the child. I shall return the animal before she is missed, and who shall say, then, how she came to lose her pretty collar?" I sat down on the edge of the fountain because my legs would no longer support me. "I don't know how you spirited her away from the guards," I said faintly. "But I do know that if the collar goes missing, you will surely be the first to be suspected. How dare you come here and involve my son in this insane crime?" I saw Riza tense and shrink closer to Eric's darkly cloaked figure. "Father," he whispered tremulously, "please don't be angry. I asked him to bring the cat. It was only a joke." "You foolish child!" I snapped. "This is a joke that could cost us our heads." Riza's eyes filled with tears, and without warning he flung his arms around this masked man, who bent over him in concern. "I don't want to stay here any more," he sobbed into the muffling folds of the cloak. "I want to go with you. I want to go with you now." Eric withdrew hastily from the child's clutching embrace, and as he turned away with the cat in his arms, I signed for a servant to remove the wheelchair from our presence. "Well," I determined shakily when we were alone once more, "was that not exactly what you wanted to hear?" He did not answer. He passed one hand briefly over the cat's neck, and in a moment the jeweled collar was gone. I went up to him, keeping a hard grip upon my turbulent emotions, and obligated him to meet my eye. "Take what you like," I said quietly. "Pillage the whole world if you must to satisfy your professional vanity. But don't take my child's heart from me just because you can. Don't shut me in that torture chamber, Eric." He turned to look back regretfully at the house, as though silently taking leave of something very dear to him. "All sensible men learn to choose their doors against thieves," he said sadly. And tucking the cat securely beneath his cloak, he walked away. The matter of the cat's missing collar was never resolved. The Shah raged and had several of the guards thrown into prison for negligence, but if he suspected Eric, as he must surely have done, he kept his own counsel. It did not yet suit him to part with a man who performed so many unique and irreplaceable services. For now he was prepared to overlook the loss. And yet there were subtle nuances that indicated his growing resentment of a servant who had made himself indispensable. Perhaps it had been amusing, even refreshing at first, to deal with a man who never used a courtesy title, who spoke to him as an equal and never stooped to fawning flattery. But all novelty pales in time, and the Shah was notoriously fickle in his choice of favorites. Sooner or later, I knew, there would be a terrible price to pay. I only hoped that I would not be present when the day of reckoning finally dawned. When the court returned to Tehran, Eric asked that he might be permitted to remain in Mesodarian, to oversee the entire course of building. But since the Khanum would not countenance his indefinite absence, permission was refused, and consequently he was obliged to travel constantly back and forth across the Elburz Mountains, all through the spring of summer of 1851. Watching him grow progressively more tired and short-tempered with each succeeding month, I sensed that the continued slights of Grand Vizier were beginning to rankle ever more deeply in his mind. The enmity between the two men became increasingly open as Eric began to use his influence with the Khanum to overset several of the Prime Minister's cherished proposals. And when I saw Mirza Taqi Khan storm out of the council chamber one sultry, airless afternoon in the late summer, I guessed that there had been yet another heated exchange of views between them. "It is insupportable," said the Grand Vizier loudly. "Truly insupportable, when the opinions of demanded magician are permitted to carry weight in this fashion. How can Persia take her place in the civilized world if her affairs continue to be misdirected by the twisted fancies of an insane monster?" A terrible hush fell over the Prime Minister's friends at first. One and then another turned to glance in quiet horror at the door of the council chamber, where the insane monster now stood listening. The Grand Vizier followed the gaze, and then, with an expression of cold contempt, continued to address his audience, as if he were unaware of Eric's presence. "Gentlemen, it is time for us all to consider how much longer the Shah will content to be served by a creature who properly belongs in a cage." I saw Eric stiffen. "A cage," he repeated softly. The Prime Minister wheeled around upon him angrily. "A cage, sir, is where you belong, and where I would most gladly see you confined, like the hideous beast that you are. Your pretended claim to humanity is an affront to every honest man in court." "Are there any honest men at court?" Eric's voice was lightly sarcastic, and raised a little nervous laughter, even among Khan's supporters. But I was not deceived by his apparent calm. I could see from the faint tremor of his hands that he was ready to kill. "God knows there are fewer since you came," snapped the Grand Vizier furiously. "The depravity of your activities stains us all. You are neither an artist nor a scientist. You are a deranged fiend who should have been locked away from the world at birth." Your mind is as distorted as your face. I truly shudder to think that what horrendous tales are being carried from court to European missions. Turning abruptly on his heel, the Grand Vizier walked away, with the members of his entourage hurrying behind him. Eric stared after him, and as I came near, I was able to feel the anger that throbbed inside him like a tense, swollen boil. A cage, he muttered darkly. A cage! Eric, I said desperately, I beseech you to forget this. He gave a short, bitter laugh. How lightly you speak of forgetting, he muttered. You, who have never known the filth and degradation of a cage. I was stunned by the pulsing venom in his voice. They were only words, I protested. Hastily, ill-considered words spoken in the heat of the moment. By a man with many enemies, he said softly, staring down the corridor. He was grimly calm, of a sudden, no longer breathing in harsh gasps with one hand clutching fiercely at his chest. And his deadly stone-cold serenity was somehow infinitely more frightening than his blazing anger. If you are his friend, Eric continued with the same unnerving dispassion, you had better tell that man to guard his back. The planetary alignments in his birth sign are most unfavorable. His stars are against him. He drew a tarot card out of the air with a flourish and dropped it on the floor at my feet. The card fell face down, and I bent to turn it over. I found myself looking at a skeleton bearing the scythe. Death. When I looked up to protest, the corridor was completely empty. There was no sign of Eric anywhere. Slowly, I tucked the card into my coat and turned away with a heavy heart. There was no more open show of hostility between the two men, but I did not make the mistake of confusing Eric's restraint with resignation. Like a prowling cat in the shadows, he was secretly and silently stalking a reckless prey. He had the ear of the Khanum, whose dislike of her son-in-law was well documented, and I suspected that whatever disaster Eric had in mind for the Prime Minister would be directed through the insidious influence of the harem. The coup fell in November when, without warning, the Shah suddenly summoned 400 of his personal guard to the palace late at night and had the Grand Vizier placed under arrest. No accusations were made, no explanations were given. The man simply fell from favor with all the abruptness that was commonplace in Persia, plummeting to the ground like a tangled kite and dragging his supporters with him in his wake. Eric was standing at a window, looking down into the palace courtyard, when the Grand Vizier, his wife, and 2 of her children were placed in a takhiran. The curtained litter was surrounded by an armed guard, and a dismal torchlit procession proceeded to the main gate, and was soon swallowed up in the blackness of the autumn night. Where are they taking him? I demanded. To the palace of Phans in Kashan, he replied quietly. Indefinite exile? It is enough. Eric made a brief gesture of resignation. I had forgotten there were children. I nodded and would have turned away, both relieved and satisfied, but still he lingered at the window. She chose to go with him, he said after a moment. His wife, the little princess. She defied the wishes of her mother and her brother, and insisted on sharing her husband's fate. I think that should willingly have shared even a cage to be near him. I raised my shoulders in a hesitant shrug. Their affection is well known. Did you expect her to desert him? I have taken from him nothing of value, he said broodingly. Even in his ruin, their love defeats me. I have failed. Yes, I agreed with sad, unthinking absence. There is nothing you can do to destroy the love of others. There was a moment of silence, and then, without warning, Eric suddenly struck both his fists against the window with a violence that shattered the glass. I have never accepted defeat, he shouted. Never! And I don't intend to begin now. I will find a better way to be revenged. As I stared at the blazing eyes behind the mask, I was suddenly afraid that I had quite unwillingly set my own seal upon the Grand Vizier's death warrant. 2 months passed peacefully enough without incident, and I began to hope that Eric's vindictive anger had cooled. The Grand Vizier remained in captivity, with his wife tasting all his food in order to shield him from the poison that had ended the lives of so many fallen favorites in the past. It was said that his fear of treachery was so great that he never left his wife's apartments for a moment, even to bathe. I thought often of the beautiful palace of Phans, with its graceful cypress avenues and its marble canals full of swift flowing water. I thought of a great and noble man reduced by his own folly to a state of cringing terror, and I reflected that even if Eric showed forbearance now, there were still many others who would lose no time in seeking the Grand Vizier's death. A fallen favorite was rarely permitted to live for long. In January, Eric left court unexpectedly. None of his servants could tell me where he had gone or when he would be back, and I was deeply uneasy. I knew he would not have returned to Macedonian without me, so where else could he have gone? Several nights later, when the whole palace was buzzing with rumors of the Grand Vizier's murder, I went to Eric's apartment sick at heart and determined to wait for his return. His rooms were filled with an odd assortment of creatures, most of them injured and in various stages of recovery. A lizard limped around a small tank with a tiny splint on its rear leg. A bat with a torn wing hung upside down and eyed me hopefully as though it expected to be fed. A cat with a bandage swathed over one eye tried to climb onto my lap and made my flesh cringe so badly that I was forced to shut it in the marble bathroom. I sat there grimly in this menagerie of hospitalized animals and waited to ask the question that was burning into me like an acid. Did you kill him, Eric? Did you? The story was imprinted on my brain by now. I had it by heart, every last treacherous detail except the one I had to know. A lady of the harem had been sent to Kashan bearing news of honorable retirement of Kerbela. Told that the coat of honor was even now upon its way to him, the Grand Vizier had been persuaded to leave his wife's apartments for the first time since his captivity began, to purify himself in the bathing chambers. There he had met with this Shah's assassins, and being offered a choice of death, his veins were duly opened with ritual ceremony in accordance with his last request. The assassins had not yet been named, and I was stricken with a terrible feeling of foreboding and despair. Eric walked into the room shortly after midnight, and if he was surprised to find me waiting there, he gave no sign as he tossed his hat and cloak into the arms of a hovering servant and waved the man away. Where have you been? I demanded curtly. Nowhere that is any concern of yours, he returned with infuriating calm. It is my business to know exactly where you are at all times. You know that I'm answerable to the Shah for your activities. Don't exceed your commission, he snapped suddenly. I am not a prisoner in one of your petty Macedonian jails. I watched him ladle sherbet into a glass with a fine wooden pear spoon. Sorry. Eric, I said hopelessly. You must know what I suspect. How the devil should I know what you suspect? He demanded. I am not a mind reader. Mirza Taqi Khan, I began hesitantly. What do you know of this tragedy? I know that he is dead. I would hardly have called it a tragedy. No, I countered bitterly. And what of his wife? What of his young children? Yes, you turn away at that, don't you? Did you go to Kashan, Eric? He stared at me in silence with eyes that seemed strangely sad. Answer me! I cried, suddenly beside myself with an emotion I could barely control. Did you go to Kashan with his assassins? Did you? Reaching inside his capacious magician's sleeve, Eric withdrew a small enameled casket and handed it to me. There is your answer, he muttered grimly. Take great care how you open it. I took the casket to an oil lamp and lifted the lid warily. Inside, on the red velvet lining, lurked an angry black Kashan scorpion with its tail curled ready to strike. Disturbed by the sudden light, the creature darted toward the raised lid, and in my alarm I lost grip upon the little box and dropped it. I felt a sting just below my ankle and gave a gasp of shock at the searing pain. Eric moved like a god of lightning, and a second later the scorpion was skewered to the floor with the point of his knife. The same knife, I presumed, that had rendered the last service to the Grand Vizier. "You damned fool!" he said in concerned alarm. "I told you to be careful." Pushing me into a chair, he pulled the slipper from my foot, which was already beginning to swell like an angry red balloon. I saw him hold the tip of his knife in a candle flame before he made an incision in my flesh, and then as the notorious venom coursed through my veins, I felt myself falling. When I came to myself, I was laying on his divan. My foot was throbbing like the devil beneath a layer of linen bandaging, and the room was filled with an unpleasant burning odor. Turning my head with difficulty, I saw Eric pouring a noxious oily substance into a vial. He came over to the divan when he saw me move, handed me a goblet, and placed the vial on the table beside me. "Drink that," he said curtly. I tasted copper, honey, and vinegar, the prescribed antidote, and my glance wandered to the vial. "What is that?" I asked uneasily. "The oil of the scorpion. It will relieve the pain and reduce the swelling." He sat down beside me on a cane chair and laid 2 bony fingers on my pulse. "You'll live," he said with grim satisfaction. "Next time I warn you to take care. Perhaps you will listen to me. How do you feel?" "Cold and sickened," I said grimly. He nodded as though I had merely confirmed his expectation. "That is a natural reaction to a scorpion bite." "And to murder?" I said. Eric sighed. "You know that there are only one way with enemies in Persia. You've cut down a few yourself in your time as chief of police, haven't you? Criminals, perhaps, enemies of the state, but all by due process of the law." He shrugged. "Death is death, however it comes, legal or otherwise. Why do you plague me with these pointless questions? There were many cutthroats involved in the opening of his veins. I am not concerned with paid assassins, mindless, soulless animals who excel at nothing else. But you, Eric, you love all the beauty in this world. You are a genius in so many different fields. Why do you set yourself beyond the pale of humanity by such a despicable crime?" He took off the mask and turned slowly to let me see. "This face, which has denied me all human rights, also frees me of all obligation to the human race," he said quietly. "My mother hated me. My village drove me from my home. I was exhibited like an animal in a cage until a knife showed me the only way to be free. The pleasures of love will always be forbidden to me. But I am young, dear. I have all desires of any normal man." I watched him replace the mask wearily. "I did not kill the Grand Vizier," he continued unexpectedly. "Oh, for God's sake, spare me that pitiful look of relief. I can assure you that I fully intended to take part. I went to Kashan for the express purpose of taking his life. The Mirgazabs had orders not to touch his throat. The coup de grace was to have been mine." "What happened?" I demanded. Eric made a gesture of impatience. "I saw the scorpion and wasted a few precious minutes on its capture. In my absence, the fools misjudged his strength and opened too many veins. When I arrived, the bath was full of blood, and he was already dead. I was so angry. You cannot begin to imagine my fury and frustration. I hated him. I hated him for being wise and respected and loved. I hated him for making me look in the mirror of his eyes to see the loathsome thing I've become." Eric sank back on the chair beside me and stared at the floor. "Go on," I prompted grimly. "You had better tell me everything." I would have killed them all for their disobedience, he continued, dully. But they were too many in number, and already half crazed with bloodlust. I left the bath in haste before my rage betrayed me, and as I walked back through the gardens to my horse, the princess ran from the palace with her hair streaming in the wind. It was dark. She didn't see me until we collided, but as soon as she recognized me, she understood that he was dead. She backed away against the palace wall and started to scream. My God, I'll never forget those screams. Such terrible, demented grief. It made me remember so many things I thought I had forgotten. Suddenly, he buried his masked face in his hands. She went on screaming. He sobbed. On and on and on. I cannot shut the sound from my head. I let him weep, relieved beyond measure by this astonishing show of emotion, the first evidence of a remorse and regret which might yet save him. There is nothing I can do, he said in despair. I can't turn back the clock and see this terrible thing undone. It's too late. Too late. Too late for the princess, perhaps, but not for you, I suggested with sudden hope. Eric, have you no religion to turn to? I was raised a Catholic, he said slowly, but I have not heard Mass since I was a child. There are some missions here in Persia, I pointed out gravely. Priests who would hear your confession and grant you absolution. He lifted his head and looked at me curiously. You have no belief in the doctrines of the Catholic Church. No, I agreed. But I have a great respect for its morals, and I would sooner see you an infidel than an atheist and murderer. He got up and went to an open window. Sung Mass is very beautiful, he said wistfully. I think tonight, perhaps, I could begin to compose my own setting of the Requiem. I have neglected my music for too long. Far too long. I said no more. A short time later, when I was able to hobble to my own apartment, leaning on the arm of a servant, Eric was already too absorbed in the score to take note of my departure. Unseemly celebrations attended the demise of Mirza Taqi Khan, and those who have suffered inconvenience and strained circumstances as a result of his sweeping reforms were the first to raise a glass to absent friends. I suppose I should have been among them, but the general hilarity of the court was distressful to me, and I felt Persia to be of a poorer place for the loss of an inherently noble man. When the princess was brought back to court, prostrate with grief, to be given in marriage to the son of the new Grand Vizier, Eric came to me in a terrible rage. Is this another of your quaint and delightful customs? He demanded furiously. Has no one in this god-forsaken court heard of a decent period of mourning? I raised my shoulders helplessly. Shah's sister. The Shah's sister is his personal property, to be disposed of as he sees fit. Eric looked at me incredulously. Are you telling me the girl is transferable? Like the Grand Vizier's signet ring? That whoever takes one must take the other? I sighed. It is awesome the custom in such matters. Oh, I see, he said contemptuously. Legalized rape is the done thing here, is it? Any man may force himself upon a woman and say it is the custom. God, what a country. And he turned away with such fierce disgust I felt faintly ashamed of my own race. I was fully aware that he was by no means indifferent to the opposite sex. Indeed, quite the contrary. A powerful sexually informed his every gesture, curbed and leashed expressed in the enormous sensuality of his hands. This sexuality gripped every audience's and made him a uniquely compelling performer. I believe it was the very quality that had fascinated the canoe, a woman of intense and urgent passions. If the Enuics were to be believed, the fancy she entertained for his presence went far beyond her interest in his magical skills. They say that each time she watched him kill, the intensity of her pleasure bordered on sexual gratification, and I had heard a whisper that she would have invited him to her bed, had she only dared to take the risks involved. Oddly enough, I would have said that Eric and the Shah himself were the only people in the palace who remained unaware of that whisper. No one would dare to carry such a tale to the King of Kings, who believed, like all good Muslims, that heaven lay beneath his mother's feet. But Eric, Allah, had he no eyes to see what the women really wanted from him? To be so corrupted with vice, and yet to maintain a child's essential innocence. Strange. But whenever I looked at him, I found myself remembering that Lucifer himself had been an angel before he fell. I felt cold at the thought of what tragedies might ensue if Eric should ever open his eyes and fall in love. Surely, God, who had punished him so cruelly in his birth, would spare him the cruel travesty of such sight. No, I did not seriously believe he was falling in love with the princess. What he felt for her now was only the same angry pity he experienced for anything vulnerable and damaged. She was merely a helpless creature who aroused his deep and astonishingly contradictory instinct to heal and protect. Had she been a bird, he would have mended her broken wing, set her free, and safely forgotten her. The door of the torture chamber had not closed on him yet, and I could find it in my heart to hope that it never would. "Are you to perform at the wedding celebrations?" I inquired at length, seeking to divert his dark thoughts. He laughed shortly. "Yes, I am to be the skeleton of their little feast. The Shah has already asked me to prepare a spectacular show. I think some trick with a coffin might be rather appropriate, don't you? I shall have to think about it." And he turned back to the window already deep in thought. If I live to be 100, I know I shall never see a sight more extraordinary than that astonishing trick Eric performed with the coffin. There was no stage, no visible place to conceal whatever mechanics governed the secret of levitation, and when the sarcophagus began to open, a tense, expectant silence descended upon the watching court. Eric was dressed like a god and wore a mask that had been specifically fashioned for the occasion out of beaten gold. He snapped his fingers once, and the stone lid of the coffin fell to the floor of its own accord with a deafening thud that made everyone jump. When silence descended once more, he held out one hand and beckoned toward the sarcophagus with a gesture of awesome authority that left everyone holding his breath. I had enough French now to translate the words that he began to weave into soft, enticing song. "Come forth from your dark sleep, come to the angel of doom, and show the living the fate which awaits." As the last note died, there was an answering shriek from the coffin, a horrible, heart-stopping wail that chilled us all to the bone. And then, with a faint, eerie rattle, I saw the Kazan's skeleton rise slowly into the air and come to rest erect and unsupported beside its master. My gasp was lost among the communal intake of breath as Eric took the skeleton by the hand and led it toward the palace where the new prime minister stood. I saw the man tremble visibly as the terrible apparition approached, and the Shah himself leaned forward in his chair, his face a little paler than normal as he watched intently. The bony visitor from the tomb raised an accusing finger at the Grand Vizier. There was a tense heartbeat of silence, and then, as Eric clapped his hands abruptly, the skeleton collapsed to the floor in a mass of inanimate jumbled bones. Swooping forward like some golden bird of prey, Eric retrieved the skull, and from its jaw withdrew the Prime Minister's signet ring, tossing it at the feet of the stupefied man with a gesture of contempt. "I trust your Excellency's son will prove less careless with his second-hand possessions," he said pointedly. There was a moment of stunned silence, all the court staring at the young Shah to see whether they dared to show approval at an astonishing trick to so blatantly colored with dangerous political overtones. The moment could not have lasted for more than a second or two, but it seemed like all eternity before the Shah leaned forward to toss a large drawstring purse to Eric. Immediately the court burst into a thunderous applause. Eric bowed and walked away, taking the skull with him, but leaving the rest of the skeleton lying there, all might examine with greedy curiosity. He had no further use of this particular device now, and so arrogantly confident was he of his own unique expertise that he had no qualms in exposing the apparatus of this illusion to the curious gaze of the ignorant. He had made his point, and he was satisfied. Nothing could have better expressed his contempt for mankind than the utter carelessness which he abandoned the instrument of this remarkable deception once it had served its purpose. I saw the Shah looking at him as he walked away, and there was a certain coldness in his eyes as they rested on this uniquely favored servant. The political gesture had been aimed at the Grand Vizier, but neither the Shah nor the Khanum could escape from the associated ridicule that would always attach to the remarriage of the princess now. I could not help feeling it was remarkably foolhardy of Eric to risk offending his mighty patron in such a dangerously public manner. As for the new Grand Vizier, once having recovered from the unnerving experience, his humiliation and resentment were very plainly etched upon his face. When I saw him deep in conversation with his son and their supporters, I felt increasingly uneasy. Wine is forbidden to followers of the Prophet, but regrettably, at court, this injunction was very commonly ignored. A slave brought a tray containing goblets and a flagon of arrack to the whispering group, and a few minutes later I saw this same man serve Eric on bended knee. For some time Eric lingered, speaking to no one, as was his wont, and viewing the remainder of the evening's entertainment with an aloof and scornful eye. I was drawn into a lengthy, tedious conversation with the under-secretary and a clerk of the Foreign Office, and when I chanced to look around later, I saw that Eric had disappeared. Not in itself an unusual event, but this time for some unknown reason. His sudden absence disturbed me, and excusing myself hastily from the conversation, I hurried through the palace to his apartment. The rooms were deserted, no servant in sight. I found Eric alone in the beautiful bathing chamber, vomiting blood with a terrible choking violence. He looked around briefly and swore when he saw when I was there. The wine, I said dully, staring at the blood streaking the sides of the great white marble bath. How many times have I warned you to employ a taster? Where are your servants? I sent them away, he gasped. And now, if you don't mind, I should prefer to conduct my final performance without an audience. Ask nicely, and I'm sure they'll give your money back at the door. He turned his face away from me and was convulsed once more by the agonizing retching that seemed as though it would tear him apart. The little blood splashed up on my hand as I reached out helplessly to hold him steady. Go away, he panted. I don't want you here. I don't want anyone. Stop wasting your strength, I ordered. Do you have any idea what you may have taken? No, he muttered. I have made no study of your crude Persian toxins. I don't make a habit of poisoning people as a rule. It's a form of death I find aesthetically pleasing. It's not a form of death I find aesthetically pleasing. Ground glass would account for the internal bleeding, I said grimly. There are various substances with which it could have been combined. Most of them produce a protracted and agonizing death. How long? He inquired shortly. Those who are lucky die within 48 hours, but I have known a strong man to linger up to 10 days. 10 days, he echoed. Then I could get to Ashraf. I looked down at him in amazement. You could never endure that journey in this condition. I must, he said. There are instructions I have yet to give, and I must see with my own eyes one last time. I shook my head. You'll die on the road long before we reach the palace. Why give yourself so much more unnecessary pain? The pain is nothing compared to regret. Frustration, Nadir. His voice dropped to an exhausted whisper, and his hands clenched taut with agony on the rim of the marble bath. please. Order attackers to run secretly and take me back to Mesideri tonight. I could not deny such a desperate plea for help. Against my better judgment, I did exactly as he asked. The outer shell of the Mesiderian palace was nearing completion, sufficient of the building now standing, erected by the hands of more than 100 laborers to create a glorious illusion of the past. The columnar structure, with its double porticos on 3 sides, and its soaring, elegantly fledged shafts, echoed back to the glories of the Persian Empire under Darius and Xerxes. But the outer facade was a cunning illusion designed to deceive the mental defenses of an unwary courtier. Within, using the versatility of our high-quality baked bricks, and with his own unique technical ingenuity, he knew that Eric intended to create an interior belonging entirely to the future. He had guarded his secrets jealously until now, revealing to the laborers only as much as they needed to know at each stage of construction. But rather than take those secrets to his grave, he entrusted me, at the outset of our mission, with documents that would ensure the structure's completion in the event of his death. I did not dare look at them, and as I watched his protracted suffering on that never-ending journey, I fully expected to be required to hand them to the master mason in charge. When we reached the palace, Eric was carried into the echoing edifice on a litter, and there, pulling himself up on an elbow, he looked around incredulously. "Give me those papers," he said in a voice that was suddenly thunderous with rage, "and fetch me the master mason here now." He was on his feet when the trembling men came to kneel before him. "You had not followed my instructions. Why?" "Forgive me, master," the man stammered. "I did my best, but the specifications were so complex, I did not understand them." Eric snatched the riding whip from my hand and brought it down across the man's shoulder with a violence that made the fellow stumble backward. "Next time you don't ask. Next time you don't understand something," he said awfully, "ask. Damn you, ask." "You weren't here, master," sobbed the man in terror. "You weren't here to ask. It has been more than 3 weeks since you came to us." Eric let the whip fall to the ground. "Yes," he said faintly. "You are right. This is the damnable way to build. Get up now. Are you hurt?" "No, master," said the mason wonderingly. "You are very fortunate," said Eric with a sigh, "that I lack the strength to break your neck. Come to my tent now, and I will go through the plans with you. Give you my last instructions. You will listen very carefully, and you will not be afraid to tell me if you do not understand. I swear to you now that as long as you show me honesty, I will show you no more anger." I was present throughout the interview, but the technicalities of pivots and trapdoors and echo-acoustics were well beyond for me. For 3 hours, Eric leaned on the little makeshift table, explaining and re-explaining the extraordinary patience, occasionally sketching an extra diagram to illustrate a particular point more clearly. The hands of my watch stood at midnight before the master mason said that he understood everything. "Are you sure?" Eric persisted. "Absolutely sure this time?" "Yes, master," Eric sighed. I turned from the flap of the tent in time to see him fall. By dawn he was delirious, wandering in dark nightmares of the past. "It was an accident," he whispered. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to make her fall. I didn't want you to see. Oh, Father, why did you make me do it? Why?" As I bent over to place a water bottle to his lips, he clutched at my arm in a terrible panic. "Give me back the mask," he sobbed. "Give me the mask. Let me go home. I hate it here. I hate this cage. This filthy cage." He fought with me like a madman for several minutes, and when he fell back on the pallet exhausted, I was able to see tears glistening on the mask. "Where's Sasha?" he suddenly demanded with quiet fear. Where is she? She's here, I said with hesitance. She's here, Eric. She's quite safe. He closed his eyes. Don't let her out tonight, he begged, twisting his fingers in my sleeve. Promise me you won't let her out. Promise me. I promised. It seemed to calm him. When he slipped from a delirium into a coma, I had him carried the half-mile to my house to Estraf. There was nothing more I could do for him now except permit him to die in some semblance of comfort in a place where he had once shared a child's laughter. My orders were strict on our arrival. Riza was not to be told of Eric's presence, but before the end of the day someone had betrayed me, and I found I had no option but to wheel the child into that deathly silent room. Why did they poison him? Riza's speech was slurred now and increasingly difficult to follow. I bent down and placed one hand on the child's emaciated shoulder. You must understand that he has many enemies, Riza. He has become too powerful. There are many people who hate him and wish for his death. If I speak to him, will he hear me? I don't think so, Riza. I don't think he can hear anything now. But he might, persisted the child. He might, father. May I stay here with you for a while? I had no heart to refuse. I wheeled the chair beside the bed, and when the child's fingers groped blindly across the coverlet, I leaned over and guided his hand toward Eric's thin wrist. I want you to wake up, Eric, said Riza simply. My music man is broken, and no one else knows how to mend it. There was no response from the skeletal figure in the bed. Over and over, Riza repeated his request with ever shriller intensity, until I knew I could not permit this terrible travesty to continue any longer. Then, as I moved toward the chair with quiet determination, I saw Eric's fingers stir briefly on the coverlet. The child saw nothing, of course, and I wheeled him from the room without speaking of it, not wishing to raise false hope. And indeed, it was not until the following night that Eric opened his eyes and looked up at me with perfect lucidity. You should have told me it was broken, he said. A month later, as we sat together on the veranda, taking thick, sweet coffee with crushed cardamoms, a messenger from the Khanum arrived, bearing a letter which commanded Eric's immediate return to Tehran. As I watched, Eric got up, brought his hands together briefly, almost in an attitude of prayer, and then opened them to reveal a heavy purse nestling on one palm. I never received this message, he said. Master. The man took the purse from him and stared at it with obvious bewilderment. You did not survive your dangerous journey through the Alpfords. A landslide, a tiger, a Turkoman. There are half a dozen deaths a solitary messenger could have met. Choose whichever pleases you and disappear. There is sufficient in that purse to ensure you never need to carry messages again. Go now and be sure you do not speak of this to anyone. If you betray me, I promise that I will take the greatest pleasure in personally arranging your extinction. When the man had gone, I looked up with a sigh. She will send again, Eric. This can't buy you more than a few weeks' grace. 2 months are all that I shall need. To finish the palace, I said in astonishment. Surely that's impossible. He looked down on me with great pity. I'm not speaking of the palace, he said gently. I felt suddenly cold, as though all the blood had ceased to run in my veins. 2 months, I echoed. Eric, surely you are mistaken. He must have longer than that. He must. He sat down beside me and leaned forward in his chair, forcing me to look at him. Nadir, the child does not deserve to suffer. All that will very soon lie ahead of him. What are you telling me? I said numbly. I am telling you nothing, merely asking you to remember that death can come in many shades. Some are harsh and infinitely painful to look upon. Others can be as peaceful and beautiful as the setting sun. I am an artist. and many colors lie upon my palette. Let me paint him a rainbow, and give you the means to decide where it ends." I let him paint that rainbow. For 2 months, the kaleidoscope whirled, making beautiful, many-hued pictures that still glow in my memory from fresh oils. The sorcery of an incomparable genius focused like the sun's rays on the tender, dry imagination of a child. My house was filled with magic and mystery, as Eric seemed to cause the very earth itself to yield long-kept secrets. Windows opened into a world of fantasy, and bridges of music spanned deep chasms into a strange and secret realm. It was a timeless period of wonder, bounded only by the rapid creep of cruel reality that no magic could keep at bay. 2 months indeed were all I needed to see the terrible signposts at which Eric had darkly hinted. The evening that Risa began to choke unexpectedly on the drink I was holding to his lips, I suddenly understood what horrors lay ahead. A dull heaviness closed in around me as I sent a servant to fetch Eric from the palace site. He came at once, and as he stood before me in his white mask and his black cloak, he looked every inch the Khanum's angel of doom. Taking a vial from his sleeve, he placed a little colorless liquid in a small glass of sherbet and handed it to me. "It will be quick," he said quietly, "and he will feel nothing." I stared at the finality of the glass with horror. "No!" I said with sudden panic. "I can't do this. I will let nature take her course after all." He looked at me steadily. "Nature is a cruel and unfeeling goddess. Will you abandon your child into her merciless hands?" Covering my face, I turned away from his relentless gaze. "I am his father. How can you know? How can you understand what it means to take a life from your own child?" He was silent for a moment. Then I felt him lay his fingers briefly on my arm. "This is no longer your burden," he said softly. "Wait for me here." Once again experiencing the curious paralysis of will, I watched him take up the Koran and pass it into a drawing room. Time slipped through my limp grasp, and there was sluggish throbbing in my head that seemed to extend to all my muscles. His voice was like a dead weight in my mind, dragging me down and numbing all inclination to resist. The moment of choice had been taken from me, and now the last sound my son would hear was the voice of an infidel, an unbeliever. Swirling, drowning in that bottomless lake, I gasped the knife of my faith and freed myself from the strangling weeds that was settling around me like a shroud. I broke loose from the spell that bound me and rushed into the silent chamber beyond. Save for the muted glow of a candle in the prayer niche, the room was in darkness now. All the windows along the garden side of the wall had been pushed wide open to admit the wind that was blowing in from the Caspian Sea. Eric turned as I entered the room. For a moment the wind took his cloak, making it swirl around him as he came toward me with all the slow majesty of a winged angel returning to earth. "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet," I whispered hoarsely. There was a faint answering sigh in response, the barest flutter of breath from Risa's slack white ribs. The boy was already dead when Eric laid him in my arms. We do not bury our dead in coffins. Washed and shrouded, Risa's small body was committed directly to the earth in accordance to the customs of my faith. I dutifully opened my doors to those who came to pay their condolences. I saw that the coffee and tea and traditional halwa were served, and on the 40th day the women of my household covered their heads while verses from the Koran were intoned solemnly and prayers said to send the spirit of the departed to paradise. When all was done that needed to be done, I went back to court. Eric was already there. The morning after Risa's death, an armed guard had arrived with orders to escort him to Tehran, and I believe he was relieved to go with them. I was unable to express my confused and contradictory emotions. I let him ride away without speaking the word which might have lifted the leaden shroud of grief and guilt from his shoulders. This time he did not look back at the house, and I knew he would never set foot on my estate from choice again. I had barely arrived at the Ark when I received orders to wait upon the Shah, and I went into his chambers with careless indifference, prepared to accept whatever punishment was doubtless to be visited upon me for aiding and abetting Eric's lengthy period of absence. I half hoped for imprisonment, since that at least would spare me the daily ordeal of attending my child's unhappy murder. I found the Shah sitting at a marble-topped table, poring over the plans of the new palace with odd intensity. The sun streaming in from the window reflected on this diamond clasp which held an egret feather in place upon the collar. When he glanced up and made a quick gesture for me to raise from my obscenes. The feather danced like a coy woman in the faint breeze that blew in from the open casement. "Have you seen these plans, Daroga?" he demanded abruptly. I hastened to assure him that I had not. Knowledge is a very dangerous thing in Persia, and sick at heart though I was not yet ready to contemplate execution with any quality. Eric's interior designs for the Garden of Echoes had always been a closely guarded secret. What tales had been carried from Mesodarian to arouse the Shah suspicious now? Did he know of the documents Eric had entrusted to my care? Did he know of the presence during the desperate consultation with the master Mason? The Shah drew heavily on a Kalian and regarded me steadily with eyes that always reminded me of a hawk's. "Tell me, Daroga," he began conversationally, blowing a stream of smoke in my direction. "Does my masked friend consider himself adequately rewarded for his services, extraordinarily as we grant them to be?" "Your generosity has always been without question, O Shadow of God," I said wearily. "You have not answered my question," snapped the Shah, without unexpected irritation. "The Sultan, the Emir, they too would be generous to a man of such singular talents." I was silent, aware that the ground beneath my feet had become dangerously unstable. The Shah set his water pipe aside in order to lock the plans safely into the drawer in his desk. "I have it in mind to present him with a gift, a little token of my immense regard," he continued thoughtfully. "I should be vastly interested to hear how he receives it. The nature of your work requires you to be an observant man, Daroga. I shall expect a report containing exact details of what shall we say, his gratitude." I bowed low to avoid looking at the smile which made me deeply uneasy. The smile of a man whose mother had taught him to appreciate the finer points of torture. Behind this sudden whim, I sensed the Khanum's jealous anger. It seemed that Eric was to be punished after all for those months of willful desertion. The girl was an odalisque, a slave from the royal harem who had completed her training as a concubine, but not yet been chosen to serve in the royal bed. There was no greater honor for the Shah to bestow upon a favorite servant than the gift of a harem virgin, the gift of a wife. When I had stammered my rehearsed piece, there was a deathly silence in Eric's softly lit apartment. The tension that pulled every muscle taut as a bowstring. He stared at the girl with a ravening hunger that the mask could not disguise, and his sudden overwhelming desire was like sheet lightning, shocking in its savage intensity. I saw his shoulders hunch against the pain, his hands lock on his knees and claw upward into his flesh, in a desperate attempt to contain the screaming tyranny of his own body. When he looked up at me, it was with bitter hatred, as though he understood the exact purpose of my presence here tonight. "Bring her forward," he said. Eric's voice had lost all its beauty and become harsh, metallic rasp, which made this girl shrink instinctively against the arm of the eunuch who restrained her. She was dragged across the room and thrown at his feet in accordance with his curt gesture. Rising slowly, like some great unfurling shadow, he leaned forward and pulled off the girl's veil to reveal huge eyes edged with antimony, staring up at him with undisguised terror. "How old are you?" he demanded harshly. 15, master." Her voice was barely audible. "Have they told you what is expected of you?" "Yes," she whispered. "Very well. I have seen what lies behind your veil, my dear. Now, you shall be accorded A reciprocal honor. Come forward and remove my mask. The girl did not move. She continued to kneel at his feet, staring up at him in horror. To refuse me now is to refuse the Shah himself, said Eric steadily. If you resist, I shall take you by force, and then return you to execution at his hands. But only come to me willingly for this one night, and I swear you shall go free at dawn. One night buys you the rest of your life, and that means to spend it in an honorable comfort. And perhaps, after all, that night will not be so terrible as you fear. As he bent to offer the girl his hand, she shrank away, pressing her hand fingers together in a desperate gesture of supplication. You would rather die than lie with me? He demanded with pained disbelief. You would truly rather die? The girl collapsed at his feet in a weeping, hysterical heap, and Eric turned from her abruptly, clenching his hands around his arms. Take the child away, he said. The eunuch looked at me in astonishment, expecting guidance, and I went hurriedly across the room to speak in a low, urgent tone. Apparently you have not understood the custom, Eric, I whispered. The girl is the Shah's gift, a personal token of his esteem. To return her in this fashion would be counted an unforgivable breach of etiquette, an insult that would never be forgiven. Take her away, he repeated tonelessly. Tell the Shah I have no desire for nubile girls. Tell him I am incapable of using such a gift. Damn you. Tell him whatever is necessary to ensure that she receives no punishment. I made a sign to the eunuch, who promptly dragged the weeping, hysterical girl from the room. I knew it would not be possible to buy his silence. The man would accept whatever money I cared to offer, and still run blabbing to the harem with this tale. Malicious gossip is one of the few pleasures left to the frustrated, incomplete male. Whatever I chose to tell the Shah when I gave my report, the Khanum would most certainly hear the truth. When we were alone, Eric poured a glass of arrack with trembling fingers. You had better go, he said wretchedly. I shook my head. I would like to talk to you first. He passed one hand across the mask. Yes, he said. That is a right I cannot deny you, but I should be grateful for a few minutes of privacy now. Just a few minutes alone. You understand? I nodded slowly, turned toward the door, and paused to look back again. Eric, why did you send her away? You desired her, and she was yours to use exactly as you pleased. Why risk offending the Shah for the sake of a girl who was only a slave? He gave a great cry of rage, lifted the table in front of him, and threw it across the room with a force that splintered the legs asunder from the marble top. Only a slave? Only an animal, he roared. You assigned person, dolt! Get out of my way quickly before I forget all that I owe you. I shrank back against the wall as he made for the door, pulling it open with a savage force that tore some of the hinges from the jamb. As I watched him stride away with breathless apprehension, I knew that anyone who crossed his path tonight would not live long enough to repent of their folly. My spies in the harem brought the story to me the next day. Eric had been required to present himself at a window of the torture chamber normally reserved to Khanum's exclusive use, the lady herself choosing to watch from a balcony above. With her attendants, I am told that from this position it was virtually impossible to see into the torture chamber, and that it was already commonly understood that today's amusements would take place outside the famous mirrored room. Khanum looked down upon her favorite through an intricately woven lattice that reduced her figure to an intriguing silhouette. I have chosen to honor you today, Eric, with a little entertainment of my own devising, she said softly. I think you will agree that I have studied your art with some distinction, and I would welcome your opinion on my choice of subject. Draw back the curtain on the window. He pulled the velvet drapes apart and stood for a moment grimly contemplating the sight that met his gaze before turning back to the balcony. The eunuchs say that when he spoke, the chill of his voice would have frozen the Caspian Sea. I see you have learned nothing under my tuition, madame. I find your choice of subject vulgar and tedious, the work of an amateur who has failed to understand her artistic limitations. There was an awesome silence in the gallery. Those who were watching the canoe closely say that she flinched and flushed crimson beneath the aperture of her veil. Vulgar and tedious as my entertainment may be, she spat venomously, it will still take place entirely as planned. Then, madame, I regret it will take place in my absence. And turning his back upon her rudely, Eric walked out of the harem without waiting to be dismissed. They say that the entertainment eventually continued in the absence of all spectators, but I knew the death of the little slave girl will not be the end of the matter. No one else had ever dared to treat the canoe with such contemptuous insolence. I knew that she would take a terrible revenge upon the author of her public humiliation. I waited for the order to arrest him, but it did not come, and the only logical reason I could find for this extraordinary forbiddance was that Shah's reluctance to be parted from a man who was still of use to him. Whatever fate the canoe was brewing for Eric would have to wait until the new palace was completed for the Shah's satisfaction. With the coming of the hot weather, Tehran became deserted, as all who were able took themselves off to tasteful summer residences in the cooler regions of the Cimmerian hills. It was by tradition a quiet and somnolent period in the court year, the last moment imaginable for an attempt on the Shah's life. But in August he was attacked while mounting his horse by the Babi dissidents, who had approached him under the pretense of presenting a petition. I could only think that these men were determined to achieve martyrdom, for though the Shah was wounded by a pistol shot and thrown from his horse in the confusion, the assassins were quickly overcome by the royal guard, one of them dying in the ensuing scuffle. Panic ensued. Although there was still a month left of the country season, everybody rushed back to the walls of Tehran, fearing the outbreak of revolution. The Russian mission fled, the British laid low. Vast numbers of so-called conspirators were promptly seized, and everyone remotely connected with the Babi sect went in daily fear of his life. Swift and bloody were the reprisals that followed in the wake of the young Shah's grim and merciless mood, and I was obliged to show my loyalty in a manner which filled me with loathing. It was not the hunting down of the conspirators that made me balk. I was well accustomed to such activities, but the horrible fate that awaited these ill-advised extremists. Even Eric showed no enthusiasm for his task when asked to devise a suitable torture to precede the execution of Suleiman Khan, the principal instigator of the conspiracy. The night before the execution, Eric came to my apartment and sat fingering the strings of his violin with a restless unease that filled me with foreboding. I knew that the Shah had been dissatisfied with his original suggestions. Not enough, he had snapped angrily. Not sufficient to teach the people the fate of traitors. You disappoint me, sir. I had expected better of your imagination. Perhaps you're using some of your favorite tales for death. I advise you to think again with some speed. You disappoint me. Dangerous words in the ears of any civil servant. Eric had been given 24 hours to rectify his failure, and I knew now, as I looked upon his quiet despair, that he had succeeded. You have satisfied the Shah at last, I prompted nervously. Yes. Eric plucked the string absently. He is well pleased with the final design. Morbid fascination obliged me to ask for details. Quietly, without emotion, he told me that the body of Suleiman Khan was to be pierced to various parts, the holes to be of sufficient width to accommodate length candles, which would be permitted to burn down to the flesh. The traitor would then be dragged through the streets to the place of execution, where his body would be cleft into two neat halves by a hatchet. We were both silent for a while, I utterly appalled, and he himself finally sickened by the ugly excess that he had been forced to dredge up from the black vaults of his mind. I watched him draw his hand carelessly over the polished wood of his violin. "I am weary of manufacturing these lively nightmares," he said slowly. "Very weary. Do you have any opium, Nadir?" I frowned. "You're taking too much opium these days. Far too much." "Yes, I know," he said grimly. "If I take enough over a sufficient length of time, it will kill me. And what a great loss to the world that would be." "Eric, don't preach at me," he sighed. "My mind is like the floor of an abattoir, slimed with blood and filth. Opium draws a beautiful veil across my eyes. It lets me forget, for a little while. Now, do you have any or not?" The laws of hospitality forbidding me to deny the need of any guests, I was silently to a cupboard and returned with the accoutrements of our national vice. There cannot be a man in Persia who is not well acquainted with an opium addict. The rich indulge themselves in comfort while the poor starve and sell the clothes off their backs to support the daily habit. Opium quiets a troubled soul, bathing its anguish with a soft, insidious balm, and I knew of no man who stood in greater need of its soothing poison than Eric. I gave him the pipe with its decorated porcelain bowl, the size of an egg, and its under stem of cherry wood. I gave him the tongs and the glowing coals that would make the precious weed bubble and fume. "If you want to retain any sanity at all, you have to get out of Persia soon," I said. "You know that, don't you?" He shrugged. "When the palace is finished, I think about it." "You may not have the leisure to think about it," I warned him. "The moment the last stone is in place, you had better be prepared to take good care of your health. You have more enemies than any other man in the country, and you will not have the Shah's protection for much longer. The woman wants your blood, Eric. I tell you, you've burned your bridges now. Make no mistake of that." He sucked the sweet smoke deep into his lungs and exhaled slowly on a long sigh. "Ah, well," he mused with a sort of dreamy, distant sadness. "Hell is full of burning bridges. Did you know that, Nadir? I dare say what makes it so bloody hot." I smiled faintly. Even in the darkest mood he retained this odd, engaging little quirk of humor, an unexpected sense of fun which made him seem strangely human even in the most bizarre of circumstances. Since Teresa's death, he had been the only person who regularly made me surprise myself with laughter at a time when I had thought I would never learn to laugh again. Perhaps I did wrong to give him opium and fuel another deadly vice, but I would have had to be a hard man indeed to deny him those fumes of peace. When the bell in the minaret summoned me to prayer, I left him alone in a familiar cloud of sticky fragrance. Presently my prayers were disturbed by the melancholy praying of his violin, and in spite of my religious obligations I found myself listening transfixed. All the grief in the world seemed to be distilled through that soft, vibrant tones. It was as though the devil himself wept teardrops of pure sound. The rest of the conspirators died in horrific public spectacle which shocked all the resident European missions. The 30 executions were personally carried out by the ministries of the state, the offenders being variously bayoneted, gouged, and generally cut to pieces before the watching court. But the spectacle was sufficiently unoriginal to exonerate Eric from any part of its devastating devising. Clumsy, disorganized, and entirely lacking finesse, it bore the stamp of our new Prime Minister's healthy respect for his own preservation. It was difficult to pinpoint a victim for revenge when the entire government had been obliged to take responsibility for this mass execution. The Shah's French physician, when invited to show his loyalty by wielding a knife at the event, excused himself by remarking humorously that he was already professionally responsible for too many deaths to voluntarily increase the number now. The Shah had laughed heartily and appeared to accept the excuse with good grace, but shortly afterward the good doctor was served with a glass of poison and died in great agony. I, fortunately, was considered of too mean a rank to be honored with an invitation to take part. I was relieved of my duties as a spy, and bodyguard and sent back to Mesodarian to ensure that no Bobby activity in the region would disturb the Shah in his winter retreat. Consequently, I did not see Eric for many months, and the first I knew of the new palace's completion was a command to attend the Shah at the Garden of Echoes. When I arrived, I found the vast audience chamber quite empty. The mass of the court was still at a shraf, the Shah's presence here today being in the nature of a passing visit for the purpose of inspection. For all its palatial exterior, the building was really only an elaborate hunting box, a played pavilion designed to amuse and entertain its royal master. Right from the beginning, there had never been any intention of housing the entire court. Only the favored few would ever be invited to attend the King of Kings in his whimsical folly, and those who were invited to do so would do well to avoid unguarded words and private conversation. Eric had warned me that the palace was not called the Garden of Echoes for nothing. When the Shah appeared abruptly at my side, I was so startled that I dropped the dossier containing details of little activities during the preceding months. He had not entered the room through any of the doors upon which I had been keeping a wary eye, and it seemed to me that he must have walked straight through the wall behind me. Nothing could have delighted him more than my very genuine stupefaction. "Ah, Daroga," he said with the gloating glee of a schoolboy. "I see that I have startled you. An amusing little device, is it not?" "Most amusing, Imperial Majesty." I rose from my knees in accordance with his gesture and stared in dismay at my documents, which were now hopelessly muddled. I knew that the entire palace had been riddled with secret passages and trapdoors for the Shah's exclusive use. Personally, I considered the whole thing very childish, a devilish game of hide-and-seek, which would inevitably result in many wonderful tragedies. It was a sad waste of Eric's talent. All he had wanted to do was build something beautiful, but every step of construction he had been dogged by his patron's insatiable demand for novelty and diversion. I knew the trapdoors and secret passages had formed no part of Eric's original design. His wonder of architecture had been reduced, at the end of the day, to an elaborate toy designed to pleasure a vivacious little boy. His very real beauty was entirely lost upon the Shah. "How do you care for my new house of pleasure?" continued His Majesty. "Would you say that it was unique of its kind? Truly unique?" I hastened to assure him that it was. In spite of his glee, there was something querulous and even petulant about his mood, which alarmed me. He was like a spoiled child who had been forced to wait overlong for a promised gift, determined to find fault because reality could not quite compare to his dream. "The secret passages are very cramped and airless," he complained, suddenly. "Quite uncomfortable, in fact. I was obligated to remove my hat." I did my best to look sympathetic. Personally, I considered the greatest miracle of this building was the fact that Eric had somehow managed to keep his hands off his master's neck during the course of its construction. "There cannot be another monarch in the world who possesses a palace such as this," I assured him thoughtlessly. "You have a great jewel of architecture and a servant who is truly without equal in this world." The Shah frowned and flickered a speck of masonry dust from his voluminous skirts. "As he has served me, so many he serves others. They say his fame has already spread to Constantinople, and that the Sultan seeks to lure him from my service." I felt my mouth turn dry with apprehension. "I'm sure your Majesty may quite safely ignore such malicious rumors. Eric's loyalty—" The Shah laughed abruptly. "Do you think me foolish enough to believe that the man's loyalty? He owes allegiance to no one, as I believe you know very well. Eric is entirely without scruple of every kind. He is a murderer, and worse than that, he is a thief." "A thief?" I echoed uneasily. "Surely a man of such honesty, acquired wealth, need not stoop to theft." "I believe that he steals purely for amusement, Daroga, to test his own powers of legerdemain. That matter of the cat's collar was never resolved, as you know, and cut glass has been found in the peacock throne. Glass! There was a time when such shameless arrogance amused me, but the gnome advises me of his insolence, and I find I am increasingly inclined to agree with her judgment of him. A man such as he is not to be trusted with state secrets." The Shah turned away and began to stride restlessly up and down the room. I did not dare to argue with him, and after a moment he turned to look at me thoughtfully. "I am relieved to find you do not speak in his defense. There have been moments in this past year, Daroga, I have been afraid your own loyalty was not above reproach." I prostrated myself at his feet in the prescribed act of self-abasement, my forehead coming to rest against the tip of his riding boot. Get up," he said testily. "I have devised the perfect means for you to demonstrate your loyalty to me now." I raised my head fearfully. Allah, what is this? "It is my interest, you know, that the Khanum suggests I should have his eyes put out." "Yes, I thought a fitting punishment for his crime against her what use her eyes to a man who wilfully refuses to see a woman's wretched lust." "But on reflection," continued Shah coolly, "I am not convinced that such an act would necessarily extinguish his gifts, and render him useless to another monarch. I wish to preserve the unique quality of this palace. He shall build for no other king. Every man who worked upon this site is to be put to death, including its creator. You will arrest Eric tomorrow night when he returns to Ashraf." "Tomorrow?" I echoed dimly. Again the Shah frowned. "Tonight he completes a minor alteration that I have acquired to my private chamber, and I do not wish him to be disturbed. Tomorrow I have no further use of him." Seating himself on the day, he glanced critically around the audience chamber, but evidently found no further cause for complaint that would have gained Eric another night's reprieve. "I shall leave the means of execution in your capable hands, Daroga, but be quite sure that no damage is inflicted upon the skull. It is my wish that his head should be preserved with embalming fluids and mounted on a pillar in the Gulistan. The Sultan and the Emir will both be sick with jealousy to hear of my new ornament." I looked at the floor, terrified that my expression would betray my disgust. "Well?" demanded the Shah brusquely. "Are my intentions not sufficiently clear?" "They are perfectly clear, O Shadow of God." I made an elaborate obeisance and backed away to the door. "Daroga, your Majesty, I instruct your men to search his apartments very carefully after the arrest. I fully expect the collar be found hidden among his possessions." Once more I bowed my head in acknowledgment. I had 24 hours to make my arrangements. Shortly before dawn my men surrounded Eric's apartment at Ashraf, and I entered his room alone. He was startled. "It is customary to knock first before entering," he said rather shortly. "What the devil are you doing here at this hour? I did not invite you." "This is not a social visit," I said loudly, allowing my voice to carry into the corridor beyond. "I come here in my official capacity as chief of police in the region to arrest you for treason. You must prepare to leave at once." He began to laugh, but when I made a violent sign for him to be silent, he was suddenly quiet, watching me curiously. "We don't have much time," I whispered. "Find whatever you have of portable value and give it to me quickly." He leaned over to touch a hidden spring in the wall, and immediately a stone moved to one side, revealing a small cavity of which he took a casket. "I have been working all night on the Shah's personal commission. You find me about to bathe." His voice carried effortlessly out to the ears of my waiting men, and I saw with relief that he had accepted the rules of this desperate game. "You will be permitted a few minutes in which to dress," I said. He handed me the casket, and when I opened it I found a veritable dragon's hoard of treasures within. There were precious gems of every description, some official rewards for his services, but many others quite plainly appropriated. I recognized a great diamond that had once belonged to Mirza Taqi Khan, and laying on the bottom of the box, the missing cat's collar with a fortune of jewels winking in the torchlight. I looked at him accusingly, and he gave me a graceful, almost humorous little shrug. "You know my weakness for beautiful things." I sighed as I tipped the contents of the casket into a leather bag and fastened it safely beneath my coat. He wished always to surround himself with beauty, and I knew that a diamond or a butterfly of equal value in his eyes. I had to go back into the cavity in the wall to find the money that he had stuffed carelessly at the back and forgotten. When I had emptied the secret compartment, I gestured for him to close it. "Give me your hands," I muttered. They will expect to see you bound. For a moment, as he stiffened in anger, I thought his insane pride would ruin everything. That would sooner die than suffer himself to be tied and constrained like an animal. Give me your hands, I repeated with authority. Eric, this is the only way. He looked at the rope with a fear and loathing that showed me a grim shadow of the past, and as I passed the rough, fibrous binding around his wrists, his fists clenched, as though in an effort to restrain some primitive instinct to resist. I felt that was binding some wild mythological beast. Only the trust which had slowly grown between us prevented him from returning on me now, and rendering me to pieces with savage claws. His wrists were so incredibly thin that I bound them cautiously, fearing their deceptively fragile appearance, and as I did so I noticed the flesh was covered with old scar tissue. How did you come by such injuries? I asked curiously. Was it that window at Tehran? He shook his head briefly, still staring at his bindings as though he could not quite believe he had permitted this thing to be done. I broke a mirror once, he said. Well-meaning and very misguided lady bound up my wrists and saved my life. Your mother? He looked up at me, and something in his expression made me shiver. My mother would have let me bled to death, he said stonily. And who is to say she would not have been right in that? I fashioned the rope in silence once more, struck dumb by the bleak tragedy of existence. And when I had finished, I went to the door and called my men into the room. Search the apartment and make inventory of all you find. I turned back to Eric, who stood with his head bent, staring at the floor. You, sir, will come with me now. We rode away from the palace in the light of the rising sun. I leading Eric's horse, and my deliberately depleted escort riding on ahead to inform the prison of our imminent arrival. When the last horse was out of sight, I leaned over, cut the ropes that bound him, and handed him the 2 leather bags I had secreted on my person. Go, I said simply. Follow the coastal road, and get out of Persia while you still can. I can only give you is a few hours. Stop before the Shah's men begin to search for you. He sat very still on the horse, staring at me. How will you explain this? I shrugged. I shall say that you used your magical stills to free yourself, and attacked me when I was unprepared. You will be punished, he persisted gravely. Even if the Shah believes your tale, and if he does not believe it, that is my concern. Why are you doing this? He demanded suddenly. I looked away down the empty road. My son would have wished you to live. All that I do tonight, I do in memory of him. Oh God, he whispered brokenly. You will never be reconciled, will you? You will never forgive. I turned in the saddle and looked at him squarely. There is nothing to forgive, I said. You gave him a beautiful, painless death. I reconciled, and my soul is at peace. It is time to consider your soul now, Eric. He made an impatient gesture. Your faith teaches that infidels have no souls, no appointed place in paradise. Your conscience, then, I countered. I think you have a conscience, whatever you might like to believe, and tonight I appoint myself as its keeper. Whatever you go, whatever you do in the future, you may consider yourself answerable to me. That is the price you must pay in return for your life. There must be no more wanton murderers. Oh, really? He scoffed. And what is to stop me breaking this ridiculous bargain of yours whenever I choose? I do not believe you would break your word to me, Eric. What makes you think I'm going to give you my word, let alone keep it? Killing is like opium, Nadir, a bad habit, an addiction. Any addiction can be overcome when there is a will for conquest, I said steadily. Besides, I'm not offering you a choice. This is an ultimatum. If I don't hear from you now what I wish to hear, I shall simply deliver you for execution after all. You have my word on that. And remember, my men are not yet too far away to hear a pistol shot. What exactly are you asking me to swear? He asked warily. I am not a sentimental fool, I sighed. I know what your life has been, and I know there will inevitably be occasions when you have no alternative but to knife first to save yourself. But there is a word of difference between killing in self-defense and killing for perverted pleasure. All I'm asking is that you acknowledge the difference and abide by my request. Now, will you give me your word? He did not speak, but after a moment's hesitation he held out his hand to me, and I met it unhesitatingly with my own. His grip was cool and strong, and I had no desire to shy away from it with revulsion and dread. I let my hand lie in his until he chose to break that moment of contact, the symbol of our simple, sterile friendship. Follow the coastline and keep to the undergrowth. It's a dangerous path. You must beware of quicksand and countless other hazards, but you dare not take an inland road. By tomorrow the Shah's men will be searching all known routes that lead out of the country. He sighed. And you, my poor fool, will be in prison awaiting execution in my stead. Do you honestly think me so devoid of human feeling that I will simply leave you to that fate? You need have no fear of my life, I said. I'm not quite the innocent at intrigue, you know. I have made my plans. The body of a baby distant will be left upon the Caspian shore, dressed in your cloak and mask. By the time it is found, scavengers will have rendered it identifiable with no other means. I am convinced the Shah will be sufficiently satisfied to spare my life. Should my estate be fortified from negligence, well, you have taught me to grow very weary of Persian ways. Perhaps I shall go to Europe and settle in a country where queens no longer amuse themselves with torture chambers. Even in Europe you will need to eat, he said grimly. From within his bag of treasures he produced a handful of precious gems and held them out to me, pausing for a moment on reflection to remove the huge diamond from his palm. I suppose I should not burden your squeamish conscience with that, he sighed. I can't pretend it was very honestly acquired, but the rest you may quite safely take. There is nothing there that need cost you in sleep. Eric, I protested, this is not— Take them, he said sharply. I have already agreed to your damned eccentric terms, have I not? At least permit me to make one gesture of myself toward my keeper and my friend. We were both silent then, stunned by the harsh simplicity of those last two words. I knew that friendship was an alien emotion to him, as frightening perhaps as it was unfamiliar. Friendship intruded uneasily on his existence, demanding responsibility, accountability, and loyalty. But I did not believe he would lightly cast aside the pledge he had made to me. Removing the mask and cloak, he handed them to me, and I suddenly saw that there were tears glistening unshed in his mismatched eyes. Take care of yourself, Nadir, he said softly. Take very great care. Your tiresome health has become very dear to me. I think I smiled. It was suddenly impossible to speak. I sat and watched him ride away until he was only a dim shadow, and then I spoke to the empty expanse that lay between us, in the faultless French he had so painstakingly taught me over the years of our association. Au revoir, mon ami, I said sadly. And tucking the mask and cloak safely out of sight in the saddlebag, I turned my horse's head towards Sari and rode on alone.